Let's hope First Dog's a good one this week.
Hello, Patriots. Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm Walkley Award-winning cartoonist, First Dog on the Moon. Let me see if I've got this right. When the previous government wanted to hold media organisations to account for their occasionally dubious practices, I mean, nobody's perfect, everyone screamed blue murder about freedom of the press. Now, when the Minister for Communications called the head of the ABC to tell him off for reporting the Snowden Indonesia story that almost everyone else missed out on, no one makes a squeak about government intervention in the media. They just bang on about left-wing opinions they disagree with at the national broadcaster. And they're right, of course. I'm happy to admit I'm so far left I've come all the way back around and accidentally jammed my snout right up my whatsy, which of course, ironically, would make me perfectly qualified to be a News Corp columnist. But we don't even need Snowden. We've got our own homegrown whistleblowers right here in Australia. In 2004, the Howard government got ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, to bug the East Timorese government cabinet rooms under the guise of an aid program. Nice. Australia and Woodside Petroleum then used the information to advantage during resources negotiations with the East Timorese government. The guy in charge was Alexander Downer. Remember him? He later went on to work for Woodside. When the East Timorese found out, they lawyered up and took Australia to an international tribunal in The Hague. Days before the case was to be heard, George Brandis gave ASIO the OK to arrest the whistleblower, who was a former ASIS employee, and take all the documents from the lawyer. Stay with me, people. It's not in the national interest to talk about it because these are operational matters. On water or off water, it's all the same because if you boil water, it becomes an invisible gas like carbon, so there's nothing to see here and climate change isn't real. So you can't say that George Brandis did any of this stuff in order to provide cover for Alexander Downer because, as the Attorney General rightly says, these are wild and injudicious claims. Here he is now. These are wild and injudicious claims. Wild, injudicious. Now, I can tell that some of you out there think it might be a bit dodgy. I'm feeling it right through the radio now, and I want you to know it's all above board. Trust me, I'm a cartoonist. I won a Walkley. Just because Alexander Downer was Foreign Minister, and just because ASIS were bugging the East Timorese cabinet rooms, and just because the information from that helped Woodside to do a better deal with Australia and all that delicious oil and gas and shaft the East Timorese, just because after that Alexander Downer went to work for Woodside, and just because when it all came out, ASIO got permission from George Brandis and went and arrested the whistleblower and took all the evidence, and just because the head of ASIO now was the same guy who was the head of ASIS then who did the bugging, and just because a former head of ASIO is working as George Brandis as Chief of Staff now, just because of all of these things doesn't mean anything untoward happened here. Why are people so mistrustful? We don't need an inquiry into any of this. It's not in the national interest. For you to be interested, you need to be disinterested. Although, if we did want to examine it, we couldn't because the coalition combined with the ALP to shut it down. Remember them? The adults are back in charge. The adults are back in charge. Oversight doesn't mean what you think it means. Accountability, transparency, those are the pussies. Don't you know there's a war on? Stay safe, Patriots. It's almost Christmas. And thanks for listening. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living, brought to you by the First Dog on the Moon Institute.
Much more betterer. Much more betterer. He was on form there. I really enjoyed that. Absolutely spot on. And he said pretty much most of what I was going to say in my postscript analysis of the First Dog's offering. Bugger. Guess who just found the zoom button? That's pretty funny, isn't it, Dizzy? Regular viewers will be familiar with Dizzy, the disabled eastern grey kangaroo. Pretty sure she has what would be called in a human a brachial plexus nerve injury in her right shoulder. I'd say she's been run into on probably the driveway. She wouldn't have been able to hop very far afterwards, and she's a regular visitor, though she doesn't actually live as part of the local flock. Who are camped over on the ash pile at the moment. So, as First Dog mentioned, the Liberal National, air quotes, adults are in charge now. And as he also explained, we spent last week listening to how Australian Secret Service assets have been deployed against our impoverished nearest neighbour in order to screw Timor out of half, or actually about 55% of the entire oil and gas resources. Because if the boundary between Australia and East Timor had been drawn up according to traditional maritime legal practices and territorial geographical dispute resolving precedents, the boundary would be geographically halfway between the two countries. But if the boundary was drawn halfway between the two countries, 100% of the oil and gas would be on the East Timorese side of the border. So the purpose of the ASIS spooks going under cover of an Australian aid or Aus-Aid mission to bug the cabinet room of the Timorese Parliament was to allow Australia and Woodside Petroleum to draw up the boundary halfway through the oil and gas resource, giving Australia and Woodside 100% of the Australian side of the resources, and East Timor got the other half, minus 10% of it, which went to Woodside for setting up the infrastructure. So Australia royally screwed East Timor for the benefit of Woodside Petroleum, and Alexander Downer went to work for Woodside Petroleum, and when he left politics and went to work for Woodside Petroleum, that's when the ASIS whistleblower started playing tunes on his bagpipes, I guess. And the brouhaha between Australia and East Timor and the spies had more or less conveniently taken the attention off the ongoing diplomatic disaster that the Abbott-Bishop Foreign Affairs duet had provoked with the Indonesian government, which is still at the stage where they've ceased all military and intelligence cooperation and ceased cooperating on matters involving refugees and illegal boats moving towards Australia. And that could be why Australia has actually had 4 new boats show up at Christmas Island this week. And of course, there was no time for First Dog to mention the ongoing debacle with Australia annoying the shit out of China. After expressing the opinion, and being the first in the world to do so, that it was irresponsible for China to set up an air defence identification zone, because Julie Bishop reckoned that was provocative and destabilising to the military status quo ante, and the Australian consul being called into Peking and being informed of the fact that it was unacceptable in the viewpoint of the Chinese government for Australia to express such outspoken, ridiculous opinions regarding China's right to an air defence zone off its own coast, especially when it's not considered irresponsible or provocative for the Americans to have an air defence zone off their coast. And it wasn't considered irresponsible or provocative for the Americans to send a flight of B-52s from Guam without following a flight plan and without notifying Chinese air traffic control through the air defence identification zone. And of course, Australia, Kiwi land and the excited states are signatories to the ASIS Pact, and it's really curious how Australia seems to always jump up and blow America's bugle before America gets involved in a ridiculous foreign affairs potential military conflict situation. So anyway, by week's end, a fella called Joseph Biden, the US Vice President, had gone to Peking, and at his opening address he took the opportunity to inform the media in real time that he thought the Chinese population should rise up and rebel against their government, which flew like a lead balloon, and whatever he was hoping to achieve in the rest of his visit to China is obviously not going to be accomplished. And that was followed by Julie Bishop showing up in China with hopes of fulfilling Tony Abbott's election promise that he was going to secure a free trade agreement between China, which is Australia's largest overseas trading partner. He was going to secure a free trade agreement within 12 months. So Julie Bishop goes over there, and the reporters have all got their cameras rolling, and the Chinese foreign minister stood up and had his speech translated, and he said that it was not only unacceptable to the Chinese government, it was offensive to the entire Chinese population for Australia to be expressing such ridiculously unfounded opinions regarding, you know, the provocativeness or otherwise of China requiring anybody flying within 200 miles of their coastline to file an air traffic control notification and a flight plan. So that's when Julie Bishop, who'd already offended the Indonesians and was, you know, on the spot in China and required to demonstrate her diplomatic skill. So Julie, the liberal neo-conservative foreign minister, an eternally loyal lapdog to the excited states, she told the Chinese that just as Australia applauded and upheld China's right to voice its opinion on matters concerning its national interests and territorial integrity, she expected China to respect Australia's right to voice its opinion on matters which concern Australia's national interest, in a patch of airspace that no Australian airlines ever fly over or through. And so Julie was told officially by the Chinese foreign minister in front of global press pretty much to forget the idea of a free trade agreement. So that's life under an adult right-wing neoconservative, quote liberal unquote, Abbott Truss liberal Nazi government in Australia. Oops, I misspoke. To be sure, to be sure, to be sure, Abbotania is the word. Tony Abbott, the mad monk, and Julie Bishop. Between them are seeing how fast they can crash Australia's reputation. Shit a bag of bitch bum cunt fuck poo. Ciao.